The Georgia Bulldogs are overhyped, or are they about to show the rest of college football exactly what the hype is all about? That's what we're going to talk about tonight on the How About That Dogs cast. When you look at Georgia's schedule, everybody knows that it is not going to be a walk in the park. From beginning to end, there are challenging games across the schedule with their hardest games coming on the road. Any other team that is not the consensus number one team in college football, well, they might have a really hard time with that. But these Georgia Bulldogs, if there's any team that can make it through, then this is the one that's going to be able to get it done. Look at this schedule. We start with Clemson, Kentucky on the road, Alabama on the road. Then they have back-to-back home games with Auburn and Mississippi State. Then on the road again to play the team most people think is the primary rival to the Dogs this year in the SEC, the Texas Longhorns. The neutral site game against the Florida Gators. Then on the road to take on a much improved Ole Miss team. Then Tennessee, riding high on all their hopes of a new quarterback and Heupel's most talented team yet. They think they're going to come into Athens and provide the Dogs a challenge. You have an out-of-conference game, and then you finish up with the Yellow Jackets of Georgia Tech, and we just saw what Brent Key's team is made up of this season, with a win that they had over Florida State in week 0. No doubt this is a challenging schedule. But like I said, if any team is going to be able to navigate it, you would think it would be the consensus number one overall team in the country, the Georgia Bulldogs. Well, what we're going to do is walk through this entire thing, and we're going to make sure that we lay it out for you exactly how we feel it's going to go. And there's no better place to start than at the beginning. Georgia and Clemson have met many, many times over the decades, and all those games seem to be consequential in more than one way in any given year. And this year's no different because you have two teams that are ranked heading into the game, and of course the Dogs are the number one team in the land. Clemson seems to have fallen off over the last few years, not exactly what we have gotten accustomed to them being back when they won 2 national championships under Dabo Swinney. But they are still a quality program knocking at the door and eager to prove that they belong in that upper echelon of college football once again. But how did we get here? Is it because of recruiting? Is it because of mismanaged coaching hires? Is it because of just bad luck? Why exactly have the Clemson Tigers fallen off? Because it's not like they don't have talent on the roster. They have a 5-star quarterback in Cade Klubnik. Kid never lost a game in high school. Yet so far in Death Valley, he hasn't gotten the job done the way the Clemson Tiger fans are used to having it done from the quarterback position. There are other players along what traditionally is a fantastic Clemson defense, especially along the defensive line. They've still got dudes there. TJ Parker, Peter Woods, and then at linebacker, you've got an All-American at Barrett Carter. It's not like Clemson has fallen off the table, but they just don't seem to be quite what they have been. And they are looking to measure themselves against the consensus number one team in the land, the Georgia Bulldogs, who roll into this game with this particular, maybe not as publicized opportunity ahead of them on Saturday. If Georgia beats Clemson this Saturday, it will be their 40th consecutive regular season victory. That streak, no one has gotten close to it since the 1950s era Oklahoma Sooners. And it is something that would get everybody's attention come Sunday morning. Is Georgia in position to take advantage of what could be a Clemson team that's not what they were? Well, all indications say yes. They have most people's Heisman favorite in Carson Beck coming back for year 2 at quarterback. They have depth at the running back position, a fantastic offensive line. And of course, there are going to be players, star players, and depth on the defensive side of the football. So everything seems to be coming together for Georgia to be able to take advantage and get a big win to kick off the 2024 season here against Clemson on Saturday. I think this game is really going to come down to what a lot of games come down to in college football, and that is the lines of scrimmage. When you look at Georgia's offensive line against Clemson's defensive line, you would think that Georgia has the advantage there, given that they return 4 or 5 along a veteran offensive line, many of which are All-American or All-Conference candidates. They're replacing their center with Jared Wilson, who's going to be making his first start for the Dogs this Saturday against Clemson. And that is the spot where I would say we need to look early in the game, because that defensive line for Clemson still has players. I just told you about them, TJ Parker and Peter Woods. But here's the thing that maybe you didn't know. Peter Woods has been kicked out of the interior defensive line out to play defensive end at over 300 pounds. Now, is that move happening because that's where they think they can get their best player in the best position to make the most plays? Or is Peter moving out there because he's just that good, but they don't really have anybody else that can do it? And that means they're going to be depending on young bucks along that interior defensive line against Georgia. That's a key question. When you flip it around, Clemson's offensive line wasn't the greatest last year. Yes, they're back. They have a lot of experience with over 100 combined starts between the returning players along that line. But just because you're older, does that necessarily mean that you're better? Not always. When you look at Georgia's defensive line, they weren't the most explosive last year in terms of disruption and tackles for loss, but they are a very solid, very veteran group. Georgia knows what they're getting from their defensive line. It is not the same defensive line as the 21 or the 22 national championship teams. That doesn't mean that they are not good. So even though Clemson has all sorts of experience returning for them in front of Klubnik against the Dogs, I think the advantage still goes to the Georgia defensive line. So along the lines of scrimmage, both Georgia's offensive line and Georgia's defensive line, I think the edge has to go to the Dogs. And at the end of the day, I think that's where this game is going to be decided. I think we're going to see Georgia run the football in a way that maybe we haven't seen over the last 2 or 3 years in terms of their ability to make bigger, splashier plays. I think Clemson's probably going to be able to make enough plays, especially early on, in the way they scheme it up offensively, to put a little pressure on Georgia's defense, because they're still going to be finding their way a little bit, especially on the back end. I think it's going to be close in the first half. And unlike most people, I don't think Georgia's going to boat race the Tigers in Atlanta. I don't think this is going to go necessarily the way Georgia versus Oregon did a couple of years ago. I think that possibility exists, especially if Clemson turns the football over the way Klubnik was prone to do last season. If that happens, then Katie bar the door, this thing could get ugly early. But I don't think that's what we're going to see. I think it's going to be a competitive game for the first half. I think in the second half, Georgia's overall roster depth and talent is going to show itself. It's going to be revealed. And I think the Dogs get the W against the Clemson Tigers, let's say 31-17, which would give them a comfortable cover in Atlanta to kick off the 2024 season. Now, when we look at the schedule, there are a couple other teams on here that we're not really going to spend a lot of time talking about tonight. That would be Tennessee Tech and UMass. Now, those games, I expect Georgia to win by whatever number they want to win by. So we're not going to spend our time on that. We're going to go ahead and look ahead to Kentucky. The Kentucky Wildcats. Now, that's the team that everybody every year seems to want to bump up a little bit and say, look out, Georgia, Kentucky could get you this year. This is the year that Kentucky's going to put it together. Now, if you've watched other videos on this channel, you know that I actually feel, I respect Kentucky. I think that they're going to be good this year, and I think that that defense is going to be better than a lot of people believes it will. They seem to think that they have the best collection of wide receivers that they may have ever had. Now, I don't follow Kentucky that closely. I can't say whether or not that's accurate. But I know I've seen enough from that defense to know that they're going to be good enough to keep Kentucky in games. And if Brock Vandegrift, the former Georgia Bulldog and the new Kentucky Wildcat, can make a few plays along with what they believe is a good wide receiver core, then Kentucky's going to be dangerous when the Dogs have to travel to Lexington to play them in week 3. At the end of the day, Kentucky's going to fight hard, but they are essentially a lesser version of what Georgia is. They want to be what Georgia is, but they don't have the depth and the talent along the roster, top to bottom, that the Dogs do. So if Georgia doesn't beat itself, I think they go up there and they handle business against Kentucky. And at that point, they're going to be looking at 3-0, which sets the table for what I believe is the biggest game in the conference this year and possibly the biggest game in college football. It's certainly the one that everybody out here is going to be paying attention to, going to be looking at, and going to make sure that they are free to watch. And that would be Georgia traveling to play Alabama in Tuscaloosa. This game means a lot, and I've had a lot to say about it up to this point. A quick recap of how I feel is, it doesn't matter that Georgia's 3-0. It doesn't matter that Alabama has a new head coach. It doesn't matter that they lost a lot of players in the portal. This game is going to be blown up, inflated by the national media to a level that maybe we haven't seen that often here recently. It's going to be framed in such a way that if Kirby Smart and the Georgia Bulldogs go to Tuscaloosa and lose yet again, maybe they are not what we all believe that they are. There will be people that say that. Regardless of the 12-team playoff and the idea that you might lose a game and your season's not over, for a lot of people, this is a must-win game for Kirby Smart and the Georgia Bulldogs. Now, I don't necessarily think I would call it a must-win game, but I would be lying to you if I said that every player on that team, every coach, and every Georgia Bulldog fan doesn't understand what a big game this is and what it means to the program and what it means nationally. Not only is it another game along the road to what you hope to accomplish over the course of the season, but this is the only team that has managed to beat the Georgia Bulldogs over the last 3 seasons. That's a little something that sticks in the craw of every Bulldog I know. And it doesn't matter why or how it happened. What matters is that it did happen. What matters is that at the end of the day, Alabama got the W over Georgia when they played in the SEC championship game the last 2 times. So this is a big one. Everybody's going to be watching it. And a lot of people wonder, when you look at what this game means over the course of the season to Georgia in terms of both their conference title hopes and their college football playoff hopes. Well, obviously, if you lose one game, you're not knocked out of those discussions. But this is the kind of game that if you win it, is as much a statement game as it is a positive number in the win column. Like, it's more than just a game. Now, as fans, we can build it up to be all we want it to be. The Alabama people certainly believe that Georgia really doesn't have a shot, that just because they've beaten Georgia the last 2 times, they're going to beat Georgia again. At least the ones I talk to. Now, the more rational among them will say, Georgia could win this game. They're talented. Georgia's the favorite in the league. But deep down, I got to believe that they believe that those prior results are actually going to matter. I don't feel that way. I do not believe that those previous meetings have anything to do with this meeting. And when these 2 teams line it up, the same thing that determined those past 2 meetings are going to determine this meeting. That would be the play along the lines of scrimmage and who can make the 1 or 2 plays over the course of the game that will determine the outcome. In those previous meetings, hats off to Alabama, they did that. They won along the lines of scrimmage, And when they needed a break or when they needed to make a play, they did. The ball bounced their way. Georgia turned the football over, and the score that resulted from that turnover wound up being the difference in the game. It's just a handful of plays. We can make it as big as we want. But I think if the players and coaches are being honest, they would tell you that this one matters. So how do I see it going? I think the Dogs go to Tuscaloosa and beat the Alabama Crimson Tide to improve to 4-0 on the year. It's going to be a hard-fought game. It's going to be close, even with everything that's happened at Alabama. Tuscaloosa is a tough place to win. But I believe this team is good enough and has the right intangibles about them, the right mindset to go over there and make it happen. We'll get into breaking it down just exactly how I think that's going to happen when the game comes. But for now, I'm on the Dogs. Georgia, 4-0 as they move on throughout the season. That brings us to Auburn. It's funny how the schedule did that. We get both Alabama and Auburn back-to-back. That's fine. There's plenty of dislike there, especially when it comes to Auburn. Georgia and Dog Nation will be up and ready to welcome the Tigers back into Sanford Stadium. Now, there are a lot of people that look at Auburn and they think that this is a year that they're really going to move. They think this is going to be the year that they step forward and move up inside the conference rankings and improve their team. I don't agree with that. Now, there are good big voices out there like Cole Kubelik, Auburn insider. He should know better than I. He seems to think that Auburn's going to be pretty good. He seems to think that if things come together, they could really make some strides here in year two. I think that if Auburn's lucky, they're going to get to 6-6. If they're lucky, I peg them as my underachiever in the conference this year because everybody seems to think they're going to make that move. I seem to think they're going to go the other way. I think the Dogs win, and they get to 5-0. And then Mississippi State comes to town. Now, let's be honest here. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this game. Not because I don't respect Mississippi State and Jeff Levy. I do. Over the years, I've been under root for Mississippi State against certain teams like the Gators. But this squad, given everything they had to do in the offseason, overhauling the entire program with a new coach, they just aren't going to have the horses to come into Athens and really stress the Dogs on this Saturday. Georgia gets the win, and they improve to 6-0. That brings us to the Texas Longhorns. Seemingly the most flashy new addition to the conference, now that the teams count 16 inside the Southeastern Conference. Oklahoma came with them, but everybody seems to want to talk about Texas because everything's bigger in Texas, including the expectations among their fan base. When the season started, well, even before that, go back to SEC Media Days. Sitting in Dallas, I was asked to vote. Who do I think is going to represent the other side, if you will, because I thought Georgia was going to get to Atlanta to play in the SEC championship game. Who is going to represent the other side, the challenger to Georgia, in the SEC championship game? Now, this was back in July, so things have changed since then, including my opinions. At that time, I thought Texas would be that team that was going to be in Atlanta to play Georgia in the SEC championship game. Given the benefit of the passage of time and good reporting out of the Lone Star State, we now know that, at least from what I hear, Texas has real questions about who's going to replace those two NFL players that they lost off the defensive line from last year's team. They're going to have good players there. They're going to have serviceable players, but are they going to have the kind of players that made the impact that those guys made for Texas last year. From what I'm hearing, they're not so sure. They have great skill at Texas. And part of that was the running backs that they expected to have back in July. But now we know those guys aren't going to be there. Texas has since lost 2 running backs, their starter to a season-ending knee injury. This is not the same Texas team that I was thinking about back in July. I thought in July that Georgia was going to go to Austin as they made their way through this bear of a schedule. And given the hype and the hornet's nest that Austin was going to be, when the Dogs rolled in there, probably still ranked number 1 at the time, I thought this would be the spot. If Georgia was going to get nicked, this is it. And I thought Texas was going to beat Georgia. I don't feel that way anymore. Texas is already depleted due to injury. They already have questions at a key position that really matters inside the Southeastern Conference. The things I've heard about Georgia over that same period of time have led me to feel even stronger about the questions that I had about the Dogs when I made that original selection. I've come around to the point now that I think Georgia goes to Austin and beats the Texas Longhorns. I think it's going to be a good game. Somewhere in the neighborhood of a 10-point victory for the Dogs. That's how I think it's going to shake out. Let's say 31-21. Georgia remains undefeated, sitting at 7-0, as they make their way to Jacksonville for the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. That's what I'm always going to call it. And the Dogs are going to take on what could still be Billy Napier's Florida Gators. We'll see how the season shakes out for the Gators. They've got a rough ride on the schedule side of things too. But regardless of whether Billy's there or not, I think Georgia wins this game. Now, Florida is no pushover. They have talent on that roster. Billy seems to think that they're really making strides, and if they had any other schedule than the one that they have that's most brutal right now, that they could potentially sneak their way into the college football playoff. He said as much. His players have said as much. I can't go that far. Like I said, I'm not even certain Billy's still going to be the head coach by the time the Gators get to Jacksonville. But even if he is, I don't think it matters. The Dogs beat the Gators, remain undefeated at 8-0 with 4 games left in the 2024 season. And next up, on the challenging matchups that Georgia has on the road this year, they travel to the Grove to play the Ole Miss Rebels. Now, when I looked at this game to start the season, I thought, yep, Georgia's got a really challenging schedule, especially now that Ole Miss has leveled up their talent across the board, utilized the transfer portal to the way that they needed to fill the holes that they had on that team. But I thought the way Georgia handled them in Athens last season, yes, I know it's a different team, but can you do enough in the transfer portal in one offseason to make up that difference, that gap that was on display in Sanford Stadium last year? I don't know. I didn't think so. But now as I look across the schedule, and I look at what Georgia has had to do to get to this point, my football brain tells me that regardless of how good Georgia is, at some point, it's not going to go your way. And now, I think if I've got to pick a place that Georgia drops a game, it's here. I think the Dogs lose on the road at Ole Miss. I know, I can't believe I'm saying it either. That is not what I thought I would have said just 2 months ago. Don't misunderstand me. The Dogs could 100% go undefeated. But over the course of the year, playing games like this one after the other, even the very best teams get worn down, the ball doesn't bounce your way, something happens. Sometimes you just get beat. I think Georgia loses at Ole Miss to drop them to 8-1 on the season. I think it's a cumulative effect. I think if there's anywhere that you might have a letdown, and I know that Kirby's teams don't let down, but they're human. And if it happens, I think this is the spot that might get Georgia. That leads us to Tennessee the next week at Sanford Stadium. After what I think is going to be a loss at Ole Miss, Tennessee is going to have their work cut out for them. I know they think that this is the year that they're going to step up and bite Georgia, but much like what I just said about Ole Miss, the gap that we've seen on display between the two teams, Georgia and Tennessee, over the last few years, is not a small gap. Both in talent, coaching, and results on the field. And you've got a team that just came off a loss. I think all that spells bad news for Tennessee, who's going to come in there with a first-year starter. I think everything spins up wrong for the Volunteers here. The Dogs get the W and improve to 9-1. Then they'll take on UMass. That gets them to 10-1. And they will end the year against the Ramblin' Wreck from Georgia Tech in Athens. Now, we just saw that this Brent Key team is improving. We just saw it on display against Florida State. Georgia fans saw it firsthand last year when we saw that Haynes King was a threat to run. We saw that he can be a good passer as well. We saw that he has weapons to get the ball to. This Georgia Tech team finally is a respectable opponent again here in the state of Georgia for the Dogs. I like that team. I picked them to beat Florida State. Thanks, Brent. But with all that said, Kirby Smart and this team staring at a potential berth in the SEC championship game, staring at a berth at the college football playoff, they're not going to lose to Georgia Tech. Kirby's not going to lose to Georgia Tech. They're going to handle Georgia Tech to finish the season 11-1. So yes, the schedule, very, very tough. It's going to take some twists and some turns along the way. Georgia will be challenged. They will be challenged early and often, and they will be better for it come the end of the year. As I said, they can absolutely go undefeated. They are talented enough, I believe, that they have the right mental makeup to do it. But the odds are against it. There's only one team in the history of the Southeastern Conference that has gone undefeated in the regular season 3 consecutive years. That is this Kirby Smart team. It seems unthinkable that they could do it a 4th year. At some point, you have to think that the ball's not going to bounce their way. They're just going to be off. They're just not going to have a great day. You could probably pick Alabama, Texas, or Ole Miss like me. Maybe even Tennessee. You could probably point to those games and say, that's the one I think they're going to lose. And you would probably be just as apt to be correct as I am about picking them to lose at Ole Miss. The odds are just against it that they're going to be able to go undefeated again. But I was this close to doing it anyway. I said to myself, am I really going to do this? Am I going to pick Georgia to go undefeated? Am I really going to do this? And at the end of the day, I couldn't do it. My football brain wouldn't let me. Just wouldn't let me. So there you have it. Georgia goes 11-1 over the course of the regular season, and I think they're going to play Ole Miss in Atlanta in the SEC championship game. I get there just by looking across the schedules. I think Ole Miss is probably only going to lose one game, and that's going to be at LSU. I think they will just outclass everybody else with the talent that they've brought in. And I think Lane Kiffin gets the Rebels to Atlanta for the first time. And I think that the Georgia Bulldogs exact their revenge, beat Lane Kiffin's Ole Miss Rebels in Atlanta to be the SEC champions here in 2024. And in doing so, will claim the number one seed headed into the college football playoff. So there you have it. That's my season predictions, game by game, for this year's Georgia Bulldogs. But that's not all I've got to say. There are a couple other things I wanted to offer to you fellas and ladies while we were here this evening, and that is a few bold takes, a few wild predictions. I think that as good as Georgia is, or we expect them to be, along the offensive and defensive sides of the ball, the area that people seem to forget about is just how dominant I expect them to be in the games on special teams. Both kicking the ball, punting, but also in the return game. So, my first bold prediction is that this year, Anthony Evans will have at least one punt return for touchdown. Now, you might say, that's not that bold, Randy. It actually is. Over the last handful of years, Georgia has not been very productive in terms of impact plays, chunk plays in the return game, and especially in terms of taking it to the end zone. But I think Evans is the guy who's going to be able to make that happen for Georgia this year. And like I said, I think he gets at least one. I think there's a very real possibility that there could be more touchdowns in the return game for the Dogs. But my first bold prediction is Anthony Evans. I'm looking forward to it. And I'm also looking forward to seeing him break out in the pass game this year. I think he's going to become one of those guys that can work in space, that can really do some work over the middle, and especially on third down for the Dogs. So I'm really looking forward to Anthony's season. I think he's going to have a nice year. Bold prediction number 2 has to do with a guy that everybody seems to know everything about and have an opinion on. Carson Beck. What exactly am I going to do that's going to be a bold prediction about number 15? Well, we know that in his first year as a starter, Carson completed over 72% of his passes. And he did so while throwing the football down the field, averaging over 9 yards per play. So Carson wasn't dinking and dunking. He earned that percentage. He's very accurate with the football. Because of the way last season played out with the absence of Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey due to injury and things like that, in the first half of the season when they sort of held the reins on Carson Beck because we didn't have the running back situation sorted out the way we wanted to, and they really wanted to protect the football and play the game a different way. At the end of the season, Carson wound up being just a little bit short of 4,000 yards, and he was under 30 touchdowns last year. My big prediction this year is that Carson Beck is going to yet again finish with a 70% completion rate over the course of the season. That's the first part of it. And the second part is that he's going to not just eclipse 30 touchdowns, but he's going to get 35 plus passing touchdowns this year. So I think Carson gets better than he was last year. That's due in part to the fact that I think the running game is going to be better. I think that the offensive line is going to be about what it was last year, if not better. And I expect him, with another year in the system and now the advantages of having the microphone in his helmet for pre-snap communication, as well as having video on the sidelines to dissect what he sees on the field, from a bird's eye view in real time. I think all those things, his second year in the system with Coach Bobo, just his maturity, I think Carson Beck is in for an even better year than he had last year. For a cherry on top, we could probably just add the fact that he gets over 4,000 yards this year in passing to this prediction. I'm fine with that. Let's go ahead and do it. 35 plus touchdowns, 70% completion percentage, and over 4,000 yards passing for Carson Beck this year. Big numbers, no doubt, but I think everything lays out for him that he can pull that off this season. So where am I going next? 2 down. Here's number 3. Michael Williams, or Captain Chaos, as I like to call him, is primed for a big year, but he's not alone. Given what Georgia has on the second level of that defense this year, and given that we saw last year they were not explosive along the interior defensive line when it came to getting after the quarterback, and given the way Georgia is looking at the players that they have and how they can best put them in position to be successful, meaning that they're going to move Michael Williams around and let him play in a 2-point stance a little bit more. Maybe move him from the outside to the inside and let him pick his matchup in any given week or scenario. I think the coaches are going to put Michael Williams as well as Jalen Walker and Damon Wilson in position to make big plays behind the line of scrimmage for the Dogs this year, time and again. So my big prediction is that not only Michael Williams, but Damon Wilson and Jalen Walker will all have 3+ sacks this year. When you look at what Georgia did statistically in terms of sacks last season, this is indeed a bold take. So it's not just going to be Michael, because everyone's going to know about him and they're going to focus on him. But I think you're going to see those other guys come through too. And instead of having one guy with 10 or 15 sacks, I think you're going to see several guys for Georgia that have 3 or more. But the 3 I'm going to name will be Williams, Wilson, and Walker. Oh, that sounds like a law firm. That's pretty good. So that's my third big take. And here we go for the final one. Branson Robinson looks like he's going to get the start for the Dogs against Clemson on Saturday. And it could be the kickoff to what could be a fantastic comeback story, comeback player of the year level story for Branson Robinson. But this prediction doesn't deal only with him. I used him and I wanted to start with him to sort of prime the table and let you know that Georgia's running game is going to be better. And to start the year, the face of it's going to be Branson Robinson, most people think. I think by the time we get to the end of the year, you're going to have 3 Georgia running backs that get at least 400+ yards on the ground this season. Again, when you hear that number, you might think that's nothing. But just look over the last handful of seasons for Georgia. The way the carries have shaken out, they've wound up with the top back somewhere around 800 yards. The second leading rusher about 150 yards behind them, and then there's a big drop-off. I think this year you're going to have 3 Georgia running backs, each with 400+ yards carrying the rock. I think you're still going to have your lead back who's going to get 800, maybe even 1,000 yards. And you're probably going to have that second back who's going to be 100, 150 yards, maybe 200 yards behind him. But that puts him in the range of 700 to 800 yards. And I think this group is deep enough and talented enough to have a third back get over 400 yards because they demand to be on the field because of their skill set, 1, and 2, thanks to injury and or suspension, like what we're seeing here in this first game, you're going to have backs have the opportunity to get more carries than maybe they would otherwise in different portions of the season. So I think Georgia has 3 running backs that get over 400 yards this year, and they may combine to finish with 1,500, 1,800 yards between them. If they do that, and then you tie that to everything else I just said about Carson Beck, then 11-1 and champions of the Southeastern Conference starts to really come into focus if you are a Georgia Bulldog fan. So that's it. That's my look at the 2024 Georgia Bulldog season. I predict them to go 11-1. I predict them to lose on the road to Mississippi, but then exact their revenge against the Rebels in Atlanta in the SEC championship game and get crowned as SEC champions here in 2024. Football's back, and I'm excited for it. I did pick Georgia Tech right, so at least for now, I'm 1-0. And as we head into the rest of the season, if Georgia ends up going 11-1 the way I think they will, regardless of where that loss comes, it's going to be a great season for the Dogs because that's probably going to put them back in Atlanta with a chance to win another championship. And that is always a good thing. Until next time, y'all take care of yourselves, take care of your friends, your families, take care of each other. And go Dogs!
Told them, how about them fucking dogs? That's what I told them.